The cannon blast shattered the dawn silence as Sarah Lewis pressed herself against the mainmast, her weathered hands gripping the rough wood until splinters bit into her palms. The pirate ship Serpent's Revenge groaned beneath her feet, its black hull cutting through the churning gray waters as Captain Nathan Reed's voice boomed across the deck like thunder itself. His weathered face bore scars that told stories of 1,000 battles, and his dark eyes held the kind of authority that made even the most hardened sailors step back in respect. "All hands to stations!" Nathan's command rang out as the enemy vessel closed the distance between them, its pristine white sails marked with the Crown's insignia. The naval ship had been hunting them for 3 days through these treacherous waters, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the crew move with practiced precision around her, each man knowing his role in the deadly dance about to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as Timothy Cooper, the ship's quartermaster, rushed past her carrying a crate of ammunition. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of tension as he shouted orders to the younger crew members. Sarah had learned to read these signs over the past months, the subtle tells that revealed when even these fearless men felt the cold touch of mortality breathing down their necks. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The naval ship's cannons erupted in a coordinated volley, sending Iron Death screaming across the water toward them. Sarah watched Nathan's face remain stone steady as he calculated angles and wind speed with the instinct of a man who had lived his entire adult life dancing with death on the high seas. His voice cut through the chaos as he gave the order to return fire, and the Serpent's Revenge shuddered as its own guns spoke their violent language. But this moment, this crescendo of violence and survival, had begun months earlier in a place far removed from the rolling deck of a pirate ship. It had started in the suffocating confines of a widow's cottage, where Sarah Lewis had sat staring at an eviction notice that might as well have been her death warrant. The cottage had been her sanctuary for 15 years, the place where she and her late husband Marcus had built their quiet life together. The walls held memories of laughter and whispered dreams, of plans they had made for a future that death had stolen away with cruel efficiency. Marcus had been a merchant sailor, an honest man who had never returned from what should have been a routine voyage to the Caribbean. The officials had offered their practiced condolences and a handful of coins that barely covered his burial, leaving Sarah to face a world that had no place for a woman of 43 with no family and no means of support. The eviction notice trembled in her hands as she read it for the 10th time that morning. 3 months behind on rent, with no prospect of employment that would pay enough to matter. The local shopkeepers had been kind but firm in their refusals to hire her, their eyes holding that particular mixture of pity and dismissal reserved for women who had outlived their usefulness in society's narrow definition. Sarah had walked the cobblestone streets of Port Royal that morning, her worn boots clicking against stones that had witnessed centuries of human desperation. The port city buzzed with its usual chaos of merchants, sailors, and adventurers, but she moved through it all like a ghost, invisible to a world that had already written her off as irrelevant. The salt air carried the scent of tar and rope, of exotic spices and human sweat, reminding her constantly of Marcus and the life they had shared. It was outside the Crow's Nest Tavern that she first heard about the position. 2 sailors were discussing it in hushed tones, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of their conversation. A ship's cook position, they said, aboard a vessel that most decent folk wouldn't dare approach. The previous cook had abandoned ship in Nassau, leaving the crew in desperate need of someone willing to take on the role. No one in their right mind would take that job, one sailor had muttered, shaking his head. Working for Captain Reed and his crew? That's a death sentence waiting to happen. But Sarah Lewis was no longer concerned with what people in their right minds might do. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and sometimes that kind of desperation could masquerade as courage. She had followed the sailors' directions to the docks, where the Serpent's Revenge sat anchored like a dark promise against the evening sky. The ship was smaller than she had expected, its black hull bearing the scars of countless battles and storms. The crew members she could see moving about the deck looked exactly as dangerous as the tavern gossips had suggested, their faces marked by sun and violence. their movements carrying the casual confidence of men who had made peace with mortality long ago. But there was something else she noticed as she watched from the shadows of a nearby warehouse, something the gossips had failed to mention. These men moved with purpose, with a kind of disciplined efficiency that spoke of genuine seamanship rather than mere thuggery. Captain Nathan Reed had emerged from his cabin as the sun began to set, and Sarah had felt her breath catch in her throat. He was not the monster she had expected from the stories that circulated through Port Royal's taverns. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair pulled back in a simple queue, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had earned his authority through competence rather than cruelty. His eyes, when they swept across the dock, held intelligence and calculation, the look of someone who saw everything and forgot nothing. It had taken her 3 days to gather the courage to approach the ship directly. 3 days of walking past the dock, of rehearsing what she might say, of weighing her fear against her desperation and finding desperation heavier. On the fourth morning, with the eviction notice burning in her pocket like a brand, she had walked up the gangplank with her chin raised and her hands steady. The crew had stared at her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief. A middle-aged widow seeking employment aboard a pirate vessel was apparently not something they encountered regularly. Lewis Kelly, the ship's bosun, had actually laughed out loud when she stated her business, his weathered face creasing with genuine mirth. "Ma'am," he had said, his voice carrying a trace of Irish accent, "I think you might have the wrong ship. We're not exactly what you'd call respectable employment." But Nathan Reed had studied her with those calculating eyes, taking in details that others missed. Her calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work, the way she held herself despite the obvious fear, the quality of her worn clothing that suggested better times, and the dignity with which she wore her poverty. "What makes you think you could handle life aboard this ship?" he had asked, his voice carrying no mockery, only genuine curiosity. Sarah had looked around at the faces surrounding her, at men who had chosen a life outside society's rules and expectations. "Captain," she had said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "I've spent the last year watching everything I cared about slip away piece by piece. I've learned that there are worse things than danger, and one of them is dying slowly in a world that has no use for you." Nathan Reed had hired her on the spot, though she suspected it had more to do with desperate necessity than confidence in her abilities. The previous cook had left them with nothing but hardtack and salt pork, and even pirates needed to eat properly if they were going to function as a crew. He had given her a brief tour of the galley, a cramped space below deck that smelled of grease and old food, and explained that her duties would extend beyond cooking to include basic medical care for minor injuries. "The sea doesn't care about your past," he had told her as they stood in the narrow corridor outside the galley. "Out here, you're judged by what you can do and how well you do it. Nothing else matters." Those words had proven prophetic in ways Sarah could never have imagined. The first weeks aboard the Serpent's Revenge had been a trial by fire that tested every assumption she had held about herself and her capabilities. The crew had watched her with the wariness of men who had learned not to trust easily, waiting to see if she would break under the pressure of life at sea. The physical demands alone had nearly overwhelmed her initially. Cooking for 30 men in a galley that pitched and rolled with every wave required skills she had never needed in her cottage kitchen. The stove was a temperamental beast that seemed determined to either burn everything or refuse to light at all, and the limited ingredients available required creativity she had never known she possessed. But it was the isolation that had proven most challenging. These men had formed bonds forged in shared danger and mutual dependence, and she was an outsider trying to find her place in a world with its own unspoken rules and hierarchies. Dennis Moore, the ship's navigator, had been polite but distant, treating her with the careful courtesy one might show a potentially dangerous animal. Matthew Miller, one of the younger crew members, had avoided her entirely for the first month, as if her presence might somehow contaminate his carefully cultivated reputation for toughness. Timothy Cooper, the quartermaster, had been different from the start. A man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a quiet manner, he had taken it upon himself to explain the ship's routines and expectations without making her feel like a burden. He had shown her how to secure everything in the galley during rough weather, how to make the most of their limited fresh water supply, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated when the crew's mood was turning dangerous. "These are good men," he had told her one evening as they worked together to repair a torn sail. "But they're also desperate men, and desperate men can be unpredictable. Your job is to keep them fed and healthy, but it's also to be invisible when invisibility is called for." She had learned to read the ship's moods like weather patterns. There were days when laughter echoed across the deck and the crew moved with easy camaraderie, sharing stories and songs that spoke of brotherhood forged in adversity. But there were other days when tension crackled in the air, like lightning before a storm, when old grievances surfaced and tempers flared over imagined slights. Nathan Reed managed these dynamics with a combination of authority and intuition that Sarah found herself studying despite her better judgment. He was not the brutal tyrant she had expected from a pirate captain, but neither was he soft. When discipline was required, he delivered it swiftly and without hesitation. When encouragement was needed, he provided it with words that carried weight because they came from someone who had earned the right to speak them. She had been aboard for 2 months when the first real test came. They had been pursuing a merchant vessel through the Windward Passage when Lewis Kelly had taken a musket ball in the shoulder during the boarding action. The ship's usual medic, a grizzled old sailor named Pete, had been too drunk to function, leaving Sarah to deal with the bleeding and the very real possibility that infection might claim Kelly's life. She had worked by lamplight in the cramped quarters below deck, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The bullet had to be extracted, the wound cleaned and dressed, and Kelly kept calm enough to avoid making the injury worse through his struggles. She had drawn on half-remembered knowledge from helping Marcus through various injuries over the years, combined with instincts she had never known she possessed. When Kelly had recovered fully without any signs of infection, the crew's attitude toward her had shifted perceptibly. She was no longer just the woman who cooked their meals, but someone who had proven herself capable in a crisis. The invisible barriers that had kept her at arm's length began to lower, and she found herself included in conversations that had previously stopped when she approached. It was during this period that she began to understand what Nathan had meant about the sea not caring about her past. Aboard the Serpent's Revenge, she was not a widow struggling to find her place in a world that had discarded her. She was Sarah Lewis, the ship's cook and medic, a woman whose skills and judgment mattered to the survival of everyone around her. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The woman who had walked up the gangplank with nothing but desperation and determination had begun to discover reserves of strength and competence she had never suspected. Her hands, which had once trembled as she read eviction notices, now moved with confidence as she prepared meals that could boost morale during difficult times or treated injuries that could mean the difference between life and death. The change in her relationship with Nathan Reed had been even more subtle and complex. As captain, he maintained a professional distance from all his crew members. But Sarah had begun to notice moments when his carefully maintained facade would slip slightly. Late at night, when he thought no one was watching, she would catch glimpses of a man carrying burdens that went far beyond the simple responsibilities of command. She had been returning to her quarters after treating a minor injury when she had overheard him speaking with Timothy Cooper in his cabin. The door had been slightly ajar, and their voices had carried clearly in the still night air. They had been discussing their dwindling supplies and the increasing pressure from naval patrols that made it difficult to operate in their usual hunting grounds. "We can't keep this up much longer," Nathan had said, his voice carrying a weariness that he never allowed the crew to see. "The men are getting restless, and we're running out of options. Maybe it's time to consider that offer from Blackbeard's old crew." Timothy's response had been immediate and firm. "You know what joining up with that bunch would mean. We'd lose everything we've built here. Everything that makes us different from the common cutthroats." "Different?" Nathan had laughed, but there had been no humor in the sound. "We're pirates, Timothy. We steal and kill for a living. How different can we be? Different enough that we don't murder innocent passengers for sport. Different enough that we keep our word when we give it. Different enough that Sarah Lewis felt safe walking up our gangplank when she had nowhere else to turn." The mention of her name had made Sarah freeze in the corridor, her heart pounding as she realized she had stumbled onto something far more personal than a simple discussion of ship's business. Nathan's response had been quiet, almost thoughtful. She's changed things, hasn't she? Having her aboard. The men are steadier, more focused. There's less fighting, less drinking to excess. It's as if having someone to protect has given them a purpose beyond just survival. Is that what we're doing? Timothy had asked. Protecting her? Aren't we? The conversation had ended there, but Sarah had carried those words with her for days afterward. The idea that her presence had somehow affected the crew's behavior was both flattering and terrifying. She had come aboard seeking nothing more than employment and survival, but she had apparently become something more complex, a symbol of the kind of life that existed beyond the harsh realities of piracy. Her growing understanding of the crew's dynamics had coincided with an increasing awareness of the dangers they faced. Naval patrols were becoming more aggressive and better coordinated, making it difficult to operate in the traditional hunting grounds. Other pirate crews were growing more desperate and violent, turning to tactics that Nathan's crew found distasteful. The easy pickings of earlier years were disappearing, replaced by a world where survival required increasingly difficult choices. It was during a supply stop in Tortuga that Sarah had first encountered other women who had chosen similar paths. The island's notorious reputation as a pirate haven had not prepared her for the complex society that existed there, including women who had found ways to carve out lives for themselves in a world that officially denied their existence. Barbara Kim had been the first to approach her, a woman in her 30s who served as quartermaster aboard a small sloop that specialized in intercepting slave ships. Her story had been both inspiring and sobering, a tale of escape from an arranged marriage that had led her to discover capabilities she had never known she possessed. The secret, Barbara had told her, as they shared rum in a tavern that catered to the island's more unusual residents, is to never let them see you as a victim. The moment you accept that role, you become powerless. But if you can prove your worth through action, most men will eventually respect competence over convention. Cynthia Nelson, who ran a boarding house that served as neutral ground for various crews, had offered different advice. Find your place in their world, but don't lose yourself in it. These men need us to be strong, but they also need us to remember the parts of civilization worth preserving. The conversations had given Sarah a broader perspective on her situation aboard the Serpent's Revenge. She was not the only woman who had found refuge in the outlaw community, but she was perhaps unique in having found it through simple necessity rather than deliberate rebellion. Her path to this life had been carved by circumstance rather than choice, but the result was the same. She had discovered a version of herself that could never have existed within the confines of respectable society. When they had left Tortuga, Sarah had felt a new sense of confidence in her role aboard the ship. The conversations with other women had helped her understand that her situation was not as unusual as she had believed, and that the respect she had earned from the crew was based on genuine merit rather than mere novelty. But it was the encounter with Angela Hall that had truly opened her eyes to the possibilities that lay ahead. Angela captained her own vessel, a fast brigantine that had earned a reputation for audacious raids against Spanish treasure ships. She was a woman who had not simply found a place in the pirate world, but had risen to command within it. The key, Angela had explained during a chance meeting on the docks, is to understand that respect is earned through results, not granted through sentiment. These men follow me because I make them successful, not because they feel sorry for me or because they think I need protection. The lesson had proven invaluable when the Serpent's Revenge had encountered its first serious challenge since Sarah had come aboard. They had been stalking a Spanish galleon through the Lesser Antilles when a rival pirate crew had appeared on the horizon, clearly intent on claiming the same prize. The tension aboard their ship had been immediate and palpable as the crew prepared for what could become a three-way battle. Nathan had called a council of his senior officers, and to Sarah's surprise, he had included her in the discussion. The galley had become an informal meeting place over the months, and her opinions on crew morale and supplies had proven valuable enough to earn her a voice in planning sessions. The Spanish ship is heavily armed but slow, Timothy had reported, spreading charts across the small table. If we move quickly, we can take her before the other pirates get within range. But if we get bogged down in a prolonged fight, we'll be caught between two enemies. Dennis Moore had disagreed. Better to let the other crew engage first, then sweep in when they're both weakened. Less risk to our people. Less reward too, Lewis Kelly had pointed out, his shoulder still bearing the scar from his previous injury. and it assumes the other crew will be stupid enough to take the bait. Sarah had listened to the debate with growing understanding of the complex calculations involved in their profession. It was not simply a matter of overwhelming force, but of timing, psychology, and risk assessment. When Nathan had asked for her opinion, she had surprised herself by having one. "What do we know about the other crew?" she had asked. "Are they the type to honor agreements? Or would they turn on us the moment the Spanish ship is taken?" The question had shifted the entire discussion. Nathan's expression had shown approval as he realized she had identified the crucial variable they had been dancing around without addressing directly. The other crew was captained by a man named Black Pete Morrison, whose reputation for treachery was well established throughout the Caribbean. "She's right," Nathan had said finally. "Morrison can't be trusted to honor any agreement we might make. If we let him engage the Spanish first, he'll find a way to claim the entire prize and leave us with nothing but casualties." The decision had been made to attack immediately, using their superior speed and maneuverability to disable the galleon before Morrison's crew could interfere. It had been a risky strategy that required precise timing and flawless execution, but it had worked. The Spanish ship had surrendered after a brief but intense battle, and Morrison had arrived too late to do anything but watch as the Serpent's Revenge sailed away with their prize. The success had elevated Sarah's status aboard the ship even further. She had not participated in the actual fighting, but her strategic insight had contributed to their victory. More importantly, she had demonstrated that her value to the crew extended beyond her traditional roles as cook and medic. In the weeks that followed, she had found herself increasingly involved in the ship's decision-making processes. Nathan had begun seeking her opinions on matters ranging from crew discipline to supply management, and she had discovered a talent for reading people and situations that served the ship well. The transformation had not gone unnoticed by the crew. Matthew Miller, who had initially avoided her, had begun coming to the galley for conversations that had nothing to do with food or medical care. He was a young man carrying secrets that weighed heavily on his conscience, and Sarah had found herself serving as an unofficial counselor for crew members who needed someone to listen without judgment. "I never meant to end up here," he had confided one evening as he helped her clean the galley after dinner. "I was supposed to be a clerk in my father's business, maybe marry the merchant's daughter and live a respectable life. But then I made one mistake, one moment of weakness, and suddenly I was a wanted man with nowhere to go but the sea." Sarah had recognized the pain in his voice, the bewilderment of someone whose life had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. "We all ended up here somehow," she had replied. "The question isn't how we got here, but what we do now that we're here." Her words had seemed to comfort him, and she had realized that her role aboard the ship had evolved into something far more complex than she had ever imagined. She was not just the cook or the medic, but a stabilizing presence that helped hold the crew together during difficult times. But it was her growing relationship with Nathan that had become the most significant and complicated aspect of her life aboard the Serpent's Revenge. The professional respect had gradually deepened into something more personal, though neither of them had acknowledged it directly. She had begun to notice small gestures, moments when his attention lingered on her longer than necessary, times when he seemed to seek out her company for reasons that had nothing to do with ship's business. The turning point had come during a fierce storm that had caught them in open water with no shelter available. The ship had been battered by waves that seemed determined to tear it apart, and the crew had worked desperately to keep them afloat. Sarah had spent hours in the galley, fighting to keep hot food available for the exhausted sailors who were rotating through shifts on deck. When Nathan had appeared in the galley near dawn, soaked to the skin and exhausted beyond measure, she had seen past the captain's mast to the man beneath. He had stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her work, and she had felt something shift between them. "You should get some rest," she had said, ladling hot soup into a bowl and pressing it into his hands. "So should you," he had replied, but he had made no move to leave. They had stood there in the cramped galley, the storm raging around them, and Sarah had felt the weight of all the things they had never said hanging in the air between them. When he had finally left, she had known that their relationship had crossed an invisible line that could never be uncrossed. The aftermath of the storm had brought changes that went far beyond the physical damage to the ship. The crew had emerged from the ordeal with a deeper sense of cohesion, having faced death together and survived through mutual dependence and skill. But for Sarah and Nathan, the storm had served as a catalyst for emotions that had been building beneath the surface for months. Their interactions had become charged with an undercurrent of tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Nathan had begun finding excuses to visit the galley more frequently, ostensibly to discuss supplies or crew matters, but really just to be in her presence. Sarah had caught herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that surprised her. And she had begun to understand that what she felt for this man went far beyond simple gratitude or professional respect. The complexity of their situation had not escaped her notice. Nathan was the captain, responsible for the lives and welfare of 30 men who depended on his judgment and leadership. Any personal relationship that might compromise that authority could have deadly consequences for everyone aboard. But at the same time, Sarah had begun to see glimpses of the man behind the captain's role, and what she saw there had awakened feelings she had thought died with her husband. Nathan Reed was not Marcus Lewis. Where Marcus had been gentle and predictable, Nathan was intense and unpredictable. Where Marcus had offered security and comfort, Nathan offered danger and excitement. But there was something in Nathan's eyes when he looked at her, a combination of respect and desire, and something deeper that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. The situation had come to a head during a supply stop in Nassau when Nathan had asked her to accompany him to meet with a merchant who dealt in medical supplies. It had been a legitimate business meeting, but it had also been an opportunity for them to spend time together away from the ship and its watching eyes. Walking through Nassau's bustling streets with Nathan had felt like stepping into a different world. Away from the ship, he had seemed more relaxed, more willing to let his guard down and reveal aspects of his personality that command responsibilities usually kept hidden. He had shown her parts of the city she would never have discovered on her own, sharing stories of his past visits and pointing out landmarks that held significance in the complex history of pirate activity in the Caribbean. I wasn't always a pirate, he had told her as they sat in a small tavern, waiting for their contact to arrive. I was a merchant captain once, trying to make an honest living in an honest trade. But honest men don't always survive in dishonest times, and I had to choose between principles and survival. Sarah had heard similar stories from other crew members, tales of men who had been forced into piracy by circumstances beyond their control. But hearing it from Nathan had given her a new understanding of the burdens he carried as their leader. He was not just responsible for their physical survival, but for maintaining the moral boundaries that kept them from becoming the monsters that society believed them to be. "Do you ever regret the choice?" she had asked. Nathan had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the tavern's walls. "I regret the necessity of it," he had said finally, "but I can't regret the life it's given me, especially not now." The meaning behind his words had been clear, and Sarah had felt her heart racing as she realized they were approaching territory that could change everything between them. But before either of them could say more, their contact had arrived, and the moment had passed into the realm of what might have been. The merchant, a nervous man named Rodriguez, who dealt in supplies for ships that preferred not to advertise their business, had provided them with medical materials that would be invaluable in treating future injuries. But he had also brought news that had cast a shadow over their successful transaction. "There's word of a new naval commander in these waters," Rodriguez had said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were not overheard. "Captain William Hawthorne recently arrived from England with orders to clean up pirate activity in the Caribbean. They say he's different from the others, more systematic in his approach." Nathan had pressed for details, and what they learned had been troubling. Hawthorne was reportedly using network of informants in coordinated patrol schedules to make pirate activity increasingly difficult and dangerous. Several crews had already been captured or destroyed, and the survivors spoke of tactics that were more sophisticated than anything they had previously encountered. "He's not just hunting individual ships," Rodriguez had explained. "He's studying patterns, learning how pirates operate, and developing strategies specifically designed to counter our advantages. Word is he's got charts showing every known pirate haven and supply route in the Caribbean." The news had cast a pall over their return journey to the ship. Nathan had been quiet and thoughtful, clearly calculating the implications of this new threat for his crew's survival. Sarah had found herself studying his profile as he stood at the ship's rail, watching the harbor activity with eyes that missed nothing. She had realized in that moment that her feelings for Nathan were complicated by more than just the obvious obstacles of rank and circumstance. She was falling in love with a man whose life was constantly at risk, whose profession made him a target for every naval force in the Caribbean. The woman who had once known the security of a quiet cottage with a merchant sailor husband was now emotionally invested in someone whose survival depended on staying one step ahead of increasingly sophisticated enemies. But as they had prepared to leave Nassau, Sarah had also realized that she would rather face those dangers with Nathan and his crew than return to the safety of a world that had no place for her. The months aboard the Serpent's Revenge had awakened parts of herself that she had never known existed. And the thought of losing that awakening was more frightening than any naval pursuit. The journey back to their usual hunting grounds had been marked by increased vigilance and careful route planning. Nathan had shared Rodriguez's intelligence with his senior officers, and they had begun implementing new precautions designed to avoid the systematic approach that Captain Hawthorne was reportedly using. But the new threat had also brought an unexpected benefit to Sarah's relationship with Nathan. The increased danger had made them both more aware of how precious and uncertain their time together might be, and the careful distance they had been maintaining had begun to erode under the pressure of that awareness. It had been Timothy Cooper who had finally forced the issue into the open. The quartermaster had approached Sarah one evening as she worked alone in the galley, his expression serious and concerned. "I've sailed with Nathan Reed for 8 years," he had said, without preamble. "I've seen him make decisions that saved all our lives, and I've seen him carry burdens that would break lesser men. But I've never seen him as distracted as he's been these past weeks." Sarah had felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something that might have been guilt. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Timothy had replied gently. "And so does he. The question is what you're both going to do about it." The conversation had been uncomfortable but necessary. Timothy had made it clear that the crew was aware of the tension between their captain and their cook, and that most of them were concerned about how it might affect the ship's operations. But he had also made it clear that their concerns were practical rather than moral. "These men respect you," he had said. "You've earned your place here through your actions, not through anyone's charity. But they also depend on Nathan's leadership for their survival, and anything that compromises his judgment puts all of us at risk." Sarah had understood the message. Her relationship with Nathan, whatever form it might take, could not be allowed to interfere with his responsibilities as captain. But Timothy had also suggested that ignoring the situation entirely might be equally dangerous. "Unresolved tension has a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments," he had warned. "Better to address it directly than let it fester until it explodes during a crisis." The advice had been sound, but acting on it had required courage that Sarah was not sure she possessed. The thought of confronting Nathan directly about their relationship terrified her, partly because she was not sure what she wanted from such a conversation. Did she want him to acknowledge his feelings? Did she want to explore the possibility of something more than professional respect? Or was she simply looking for reassurance that she was not imagining the connection she felt between them? The opportunity had come sooner than she expected. They had been anchored in a secluded cove, making repairs to damage from their latest encounter with a merchant vessel, when Nathan had asked her to walk with him along the beach. The request had been casual, but there had been something in his manner that suggested it was anything but routine. The beach had been deserted except for a few crew members gathering firewood in the distance. The setting sun had painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the gentle sound of waves against sand had provided a peaceful backdrop for what Sarah sensed would be a significant conversation. They had walked in silence for several minutes before Nathan had finally spoken. "Timothy tells me the crew is concerned about us." The directness of his approach had surprised her, but she had appreciated his willingness to address the situation openly. "Are you concerned about us?" "Yes," he had replied without hesitation. "But not for the reasons you might think." He had stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. "Sarah, you've become important to this crew in ways that go beyond your official duties. The men look to you for stability, for a reminder of the civilized world they've left behind. But you've also become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with the ship or the crew." The admission had sent Sarah's heart racing, but she had forced herself to remain calm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you in ways that could compromise my judgment as captain. I'm saying that when I make decisions about risks and routes and targets, I find myself thinking about how those decisions might affect you rather than just considering what's best for the ship." Nathan had paused, running a hand through his graying hair in a gesture that revealed his own uncertainty. "I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know what to do about it." The words had hung in the air between them like a challenge, demanding a response that Sarah was not sure she was ready to give. But as she looked into Nathan's eyes, she had seen not just desire but vulnerability, the same kind of uncertainty that had driven her to seek employment aboard his ship in the first place. "I'm already in love with you," she had replied quietly. "I have been for weeks, maybe months, and I don't know I'll know what to do about it either." The confession had changed everything and nothing. They had stood there on the beach, finally acknowledging what had been building between them for months. But they had also been acutely aware that acknowledgement alone could not solve the practical problems their feelings created. Nathan had reached out to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her skin. "This complicates everything." "Yes," Sarah had agreed, but ignoring it wasn't making it go away. They had talked for hours as the sun set and the stars appeared overhead. They had discussed the challenges their relationship would create, the need to maintain discipline and authority aboard the ship, the dangers of emotional entanglement in a profession where clear thinking could mean the difference between life and death. But they had also talked about possibilities, about the ways they might navigate their feelings without compromising the crew's safety or their own integrity. They had agreed that their relationship, whatever form it took, would have to remain secondary to their responsibilities aboard the ship. But they had also agreed that denying their feelings entirely was neither possible nor healthy. When they had finally returned to the ship, they had done so with a new understanding between them. Nothing had been definitively resolved, but everything had been acknowledged, and that acknowledgement had created a foundation for whatever might develop between them. The weeks following their conversation on the beach had been marked by a careful balance between personal feelings and professional responsibilities. Nathan and Sarah had continued their duties as captain and cook, but there had been a new dimension to their interactions, an acknowledgement of deeper currents that ran beneath the surface of their daily routines. The crew had noticed the change, but their response had been more positive than either Nathan or Sarah had expected. Rather than seeing their relationship as a threat to ship discipline, most of the men had seemed to view it as a stabilizing influence that made their captain more human and more approachable. Maria Allen, a woman they had rescued from a Spanish slave ship during a raid, had provided Sarah with a different perspective on her situation. Maria had chosen to remain with the crew rather than be dropped off at the nearest port, and her presence had created an interesting dynamic aboard the ship. "You think too much about what others expect," Maria had told Sarah during one of their conversations. "These men chose this life because they rejected society's expectations. Why should they judge you for doing the same?" The observation had been insightful, and it had helped Sarah understand that her concerns about propriety and convention were largely irrelevant in their current context. The rules that governed relationships in respectable society had no application aboard a pirate ship, where survival and competence mattered more than social norms. But their developing relationship had also been tested by the increasing pressure from Captain Hawthorne's systematic campaign against pirate activity. The naval commander's tactics had proven even more effective than Rodriguez had warned, and several crews that had operated successfully for years had been captured or destroyed. The Serpent's Revenge had been forced to alter its patterns and hunting grounds, avoiding areas where Hawthorne's ships were known to patrol. The changes had reduced their opportunities for profitable raids, and the crew had begun to feel the financial pressure of their more cautious approach. It had been during this period of increased caution that they had received intelligence about a Spanish treasure ship that would be traveling through waters that Hawthorne's patrols had not yet reached. The cargo was reportedly substantial enough to provide financial security for months, but the route would take them through areas where they would be vulnerable to interception. The decision to pursue the treasure ship had not been made lightly. Nathan had consulted with his senior officers and had even sought Sarah's opinion on the crew's morale and readiness for a challenging operation. The discussion had taken place in his cabin, with charts spread across his desk and the weight of command evident in every line of his face. "The risk is significant," he had admitted. "If Hawthorne has extended his patrol routes, we could find ourselves trapped between the Spanish ship's escort and a naval squadron. But if we don't take risks, we'll slowly starve as our supplies and funds dwindle." Sarah had studied the charts, her understanding of navigation and tactical planning having improved considerably during her months aboard the ship. The proposed route would take them through narrow waters where maneuverability would be limited, but it would also allow them to approach their target from an unexpected direction. "What does your instinct tell you?" she had asked. Nathan had smiled at the question, recognizing that she was asking him to trust the intuition that had kept him alive through years of dangerous decisions. "My instinct tells me that we can't live in fear forever. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve anything worthwhile." The decision had been made to pursue the treasure ship, but with modifications to their usual tactics designed to minimize their exposure to Hawthorne's forces. They would approach from the south rather than their traditional northern route, and they would have contingency plans for rapid withdrawal if naval ships appeared. The preparation for the raid had brought out the best in the crew, reminding Sarah of why she had come to respect these men despite their chosen profession. They had worked with focused efficiency to prepare the ship and weapons, and their discussions of tactics had revealed a level of professional competence that would have impressed any naval officer. But the preparation had also heightened Sarah's awareness of the dangers Nathan faced as their leader. Every decision he made carried the potential for disaster, and the weight of that responsibility was evident in the way he carried himself during the days leading up to their departure. She had found herself spending more time in his cabin during the evening hours, ostensibly helping with the logistical planning, but really just wanting to be near him as he wrestled with the complexities of command. Their relationship had deepened during these quiet moments, built on shared understanding and mutual respect rather than just physical attraction. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met under different circumstances?" Nathan had asked one evening as they worked together over supply inventories. Sarah had considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we would have been different people under different circumstances. The woman who lived in that cottage in Port Royal might never have had the courage to speak to a man like you, and the merchant captain you once were might never have noticed a widow struggling to pay her rent." The observation had pleased Nathan, and Sarah had realized that their relationship was built on who they had become rather than who they had once been. The trials and challenges that had brought them both to the Serpent's Revenge had also created the versions of themselves that were capable of loving each other. As their departure date had approached, Sarah had felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that was becoming familiar. Each raid brought the possibility of wealth and success, but it also brought the very real chance that some of the men she had come to care about would not return. The thought of losing Nathan was particularly painful, but she had learned to accept that fear as part of the price of loving someone who lived by taking risks. The night before their departure, Nathan had come to the galley after the rest of the crew had retired. They had sat together in the dim light of a single lantern, not talking much, but drawing comfort from each other's presence. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he had said finally, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life." Sarah had felt tears threatening but had held them back. "Don't talk as if you are not coming back." "I'm not planning to die," Nathan had replied with a smile. "But I've learned that plans don't always survive contact with reality. If something does happen to me, I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope for a future that extends beyond just survival." The morning of the raid had dawned clear and calm, with favorable winds that would allow them to make good time to their target area. The crew had moved with practiced efficiency as they prepared the ship for action, but there had been an undercurrent of tension that spoke to the significance of what they were attempting. Sarah had watched from the galley as Nathan addressed the crew, outlining their plan and emphasizing the importance of discipline and coordination. His voice had carried the authority that had made him a successful captain. But she had also heard the concern that came from caring about the men who followed his orders. The Spanish treasure ship had been where their intelligence had indicated it would be, sailing with a small escort of two naval vessels through waters that should have been safe from pirate attack. The cargo manifest that their informant had provided suggested a shipment of silver and gold that would provide financial security for the entire crew for months to come. But as they had closed in on their target, lookouts had spotted sails on the horizon that had not been part of their calculations. Captain Hawthorne's systematic approach had apparently extended to coordinating with Spanish naval forces, and what should have been a straightforward raid had suddenly become a potential trap. Nathan had been forced to make a split-second decision that would determine whether they pressed forward with the attack or withdrew to fight another day. The treasure ship was within their grasp, but the approaching naval vessels could cut off their escape route if the raid took too long to complete. "Signal the attack," he had ordered, his voice carrying across the deck and with absolute certainty. "We finish this quickly and get out before those ships can close the distance." The battle had been fierce but brief, with the Spanish escort vessels proving less formidable than their intelligence had suggested. The treasure ship had surrendered after a short but intense exchange of cannon fire, and the crew had worked with desperate efficiency to transfer the most valuable cargo to their own hold. But even as they had celebrated their success, the approaching sails had grown larger on the horizon, and it had become clear that Captain Hawthorne had indeed coordinated this trap with Spanish forces. The Serpent's Revenge had found itself racing against time to complete the transfer and escape before superior forces could surround them. Sarah had worked alongside the crew during the transfer, helping to move heavy chests of silver and gold from the Spanish ship to their own hold. The physical labor had been exhausting, but the excitement of success had energized everyone involved. They had captured a prize that would provide security for months, but they had also proven that they could outmaneuver even Hawthorne's systematic approach. The escape had required every bit of Nathan's skill as a navigator and tactician. The approaching naval ships had superior firepower and numbers, but the Serpent's Revenge had advantages in speed and maneuverability that Nathan had used to maximum effect. They had threaded through narrow channels and used wind patterns that larger ships could not exploit, staying just ahead of their pursuers as they raced for open water. But the chase had continued for hours, with the naval ships maintaining pressure and forcing them to use every trick and advantage they possessed. Sarah had remained in the galley during most of the pursuit, keeping hot food and medical supplies ready for whatever the day might bring, but she had also been acutely aware of the deadly game being played on the waters around them. It had been during the final phase of the chase that the naval ships had managed to close the distance enough to bring their guns to bear. The first cannon shots had fallen short, sending up geysers of water that had drenched the deck but caused no damage. But subsequent volleys had grown more accurate, and it had become clear that a direct confrontation was inevitable. Nathan had ordered the crew to battle stations, and Sarah had felt her heart pounding as she realized that everything they had built together was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. The months of growing trust and affection, the careful balance between personal feelings and professional responsibilities, the sense of belonging she had found among these unlikely companions, all of it was now at risk in a battle that would determine whether they lived or died as free people. The first direct hit had struck their stern, sending splinters flying across the deck and reminding everyone aboard that naval guns could tear their ship apart if the battle lasted too long. But Nathan's response had been immediate and decisive, ordering a sharp turn that brought their own guns to bear on the nearest pursuing vessel. The Serpent's Revenge had replied with a coordinated broadside that had sent iron death screaming across the water toward their pursuers. The crew had worked with desperate efficiency to reload and fire again, their movements coordinated by months of practice and the knowledge that their survival depended on superior gunnery and tactics. Sarah had emerged from the galley during a brief lull in the fighting, carrying water and bandages for the wounded, and she had seen Nathan standing at the ship's wheel with his face set in lines of absolute concentration. He had been calculating angles and distances, wind speed and current direction, balancing dozens of variables in split-second decisions that would determine their fate. When their eyes had met across the chaos of the deck, she had seen not fear but determination, the look of a man who had accepted the risks of his chosen life and was prepared to face whatever consequences might come. But she had also seen love, the acknowledgement that he was fighting not just for his own survival, but for the future they had begun to envision together. The battle had continued with increasing intensity as more naval ships had appeared on the horizon, drawn by the sound of cannon fire and the smoke that marked their position. What had begun as a pursuit by two ships had evolved into a running battle against a coordinated squadron that was determined to end the Serpent's Revenge's career once and for all. The turning point in the battle had come when Dennis Moore, their navigator, had spotted a gap in the naval formation that would allow them to break through to open water. But reaching that gap would require sailing directly between two enemy ships, exposing them to concentrated fire from both sides for several crucial minutes. Nathan had not hesitated when presented with the option. "All hands prepare for close action," he had shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of cannon fire and splintering wood. "We're going through the middle of them." The maneuver had required precise timing and absolute trust in Nathan's judgment. The crew had worked with desperate efficiency to prepare for the gauntlet they were about to run, securing loose equipment and preparing for the devastating fire they would face during their dash for freedom. Sarah had positioned herself in the galley where she could treat wounded men as they were brought below, but she had also been able to watch through the small porthole as the enemy ships grew larger and more menacing. The Spanish naval vessels were heavily armed and professionally crewed, representing the kind of organized opposition that had destroyed so many pirate crews in recent months. As they had approached the gap between the enemy ships, the intensity of fire had increased dramatically. Iron shot had screamed overhead and crashed into the water around them, sending up fountains of spray that had drenched the deck. The sound of splintering wood and shouting men had filled the air, creating a chaos that had tested everyone's nerve and training. The first casualties had been brought to Sarah within minutes of entering the gauntlet. Lewis Kelly had taken a splinter in his leg, and Matthew Miller had been knocked unconscious by a falling block. She had worked quickly to treat their injuries while listening to the battle raging above her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. But it had been the sight of Timothy Cooper being carried below with blood streaming from a head wound that had truly brought home the deadly reality of their situation. The quartermaster, who had been her first friend aboard the ship, who had taught her the routines and expectations that had allowed her to find her place among the crew, was now unconscious and possibly dying in her arms. She had worked over Timothy with desperate intensity, cleaning and dressing his wound while monitoring his breathing and pulse. The injury had looked worse than it actually was, but the sight of so much blood had reminded her of how quickly everything she cared about could be taken away. Above deck, the battle had reached its crescendo as they had passed between the enemy ships with guns blazing from both sides. The Serpent's Revenge had shuddered under the impact of multiple hits, but Nathan's seamanship had kept them moving at maximum speed toward the open water that represented safety. The breakthrough had been achieved at considerable cost. Several crew members had been wounded, and the ship itself had suffered damage that would require extensive repairs. But they had escaped the trap that Captain Hawthorne had set for them, and they had done so with their prize intact and their freedom preserved. As the enemy ships had fallen behind and the immediate danger had passed, Sarah had emerged from the galley to find Nathan still at the wheel, his face grim but satisfied. The deck around him had been littered with debris from the battle, and several crew members had been working to secure damaged rigging and assess the extent of their injuries. When Nathan had finally turned the wheel over to Dennis Moore and approached her, Sarah had seen the exhaustion and relief in his eyes. They had survived another test, but the cost had been high, and the knowledge that they would face similar challenges in the future had weighed heavily on both of them. "How are the wounded?" he had asked. His first concern is always being for his crew. "Timothy has a concussion, but he should recover fully. Lewis and Matthew will be fine in a few days. We were lucky." Nathan had nodded, but his expression had remained serious. This was just the beginning. Hawthorne isn't going to give up after one failure. He'll learn from this encounter and adjust his tactics accordingly. The observation had been accurate, and in the days that followed, they had received reports that confirmed Nathan's assessment. Captain Hawthorne had indeed analyzed their escape and was implementing new strategies designed to prevent similar breakouts in the future. The naval commander was proving to be as intelligent and adaptable as he was determined. But the successful raid had also provided them with resources that would allow them to operate independently for months without taking unnecessary risks. The treasure they had captured from the Spanish ship would fund repairs, supplies, and crew payments, while they developed new strategies for dealing with increased naval pressure. More importantly for Sarah, the battle had demonstrated the strength of the bonds that held the crew together. Under extreme pressure, with their lives at stake, these men had worked together with a coordination and mutual trust that would have impressed any military commander. They were not just pirates bound together by greed and desperation, but a community that had chosen to face the world's dangers as a unified force. The realization had made Sarah understand that her place aboard the Serpent's Revenge was not just a matter of employment or survival, but of belonging to something larger than herself. These men had accepted her not because they felt sorry for her or because they needed a cook, but because she had proven herself capable of contributing to their shared enterprise. In the weeks following the battle, as they had made repairs and planned their next moves, Sarah had found herself thinking about the future in ways that would have been impossible during her previous life. The widow who had faced eviction in Port Royal had been focused entirely on immediate survival, but the woman she had become aboard the pirate ship was beginning to envision possibilities that extended far beyond mere existence. Her relationship with Nathan had deepened as they had worked together to address the challenges created by increased naval pressure. They had spent long hours discussing strategy and tactics, and Sarah had found herself contributing insights that proved valuable in planning their future operations. "You have a talent for this," Nathan had told her one evening as they had reviewed intelligence reports about naval movements. "You see patterns and connections that others miss." The compliment had meant more to Sarah than any romantic gesture could have, because it had acknowledged that her contributions were based on genuine ability rather than sentiment. She had earned her place in Nathan's confidence through competence and judgment, just as she had earned her place among the crew. As the months had passed and their relationship had continued to evolve, Sarah had begun to understand that she had found something aboard the Serpent's Revenge that she had never known she was looking for. It was not just love or security or belonging, but a sense of purpose that came from being genuinely needed and valued for her unique contributions. The woman who had once sat in a cottage reading eviction notices had discovered that she possessed capabilities she had never suspected. She could treat serious injuries under pressure, contribute to strategic planning, maintain morale during difficult times, and serve as a stabilizing influence that helped hold a diverse group of strong-willed men together as an effective unit. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that she was capable of loving and being loved in ways that transcended conventional expectations and social norms. Her relationship with Nathan had grown into something deeper and more complex than simple romance, built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the knowledge that they had chosen each other despite all the obstacles that should have kept them apart. The latest intelligence about Captain Hawthorne's activities had suggested that the naval commander was preparing a major offensive designed to eliminate pirate activity in the Caribbean once and for all. Multiple squadrons were being coordinated, and new tactics were being implemented that would make traditional pirate havens untenable. But rather than feeling defeated by this news, Sarah had found herself energized by the challenge it represented. The crew of the Serpent's Revenge had proven their ability to adapt and overcome obstacles, and she had confidence in their collective ability to find ways to survive and prosper even under increased pressure. "We'll need to be smarter and more careful," Nathan had said during their latest planning session. "But we've always succeeded by being more flexible and innovative than our enemies. There's no reason that should change now." Sarah had agreed, but she had also understood that their success would depend on maintaining the unity and purpose that had carried them through previous challenges. The crew would need to continue trusting Nathan's leadership, and Nathan would need to continue making decisions based on clear judgment rather than emotional considerations. The balance between their personal relationship and their professional responsibilities had become easier to maintain as both of them had gained experience in managing the complexities involved. They had learned to compartmentalize their feelings when necessary while still drawing strength from their connection during difficult times. Standing on the deck of the Serpent's Revenge, as it cut through the Caribbean waters under a brilliant sunset, Sarah had reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate widow who had approached Nathan's ship with nothing but determination and necessity had evolved into a woman who was genuinely valued for her contributions to a community that operated outside conventional society's rules. She had found love with a man who respected her intelligence and capabilities, friendship with people who judged her by her actions rather than her circumstances, and a sense of purpose that came from knowing that her presence made a real difference in the lives of people she cared about. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges from naval forces that were becoming increasingly sophisticated and determined. But Sarah had learned that uncertainty could be exciting rather than terrifying when faced with people who shared your commitment to freedom and mutual support. As Nathan had approached her at the ship's rail, his expression showing the contentment that had become more common since they had acknowledged their feelings for each other, Sarah had realized that she had indeed found the best days of her life in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. "Any regrets?" he had asked, echoing a conversation they had shared months earlier on a beach in Nassau. Sarah had looked around at the crew working efficiently on the deck, at the ship that had become her home, at the endless expanse of ocean that represented both danger and possibility. "None at all," she had replied, and she had meant it completely. The job that everyone had refused, the position aboard a ruthless pirate ship that had seemed like a desperate last resort, had given her everything she had never known she wanted. She had found strength she had never suspected, love she had never expected, and a community where her contributions mattered in ways that conventional society had never allowed. The Serpent's Revenge sailed on through the Caribbean sunset, carrying a crew that had learned to face the world's challenges together. And Sarah Lewis smiled as she contemplated the adventures that still lay ahead. She had taken the job everyone refused and discovered that sometimes the most frightening choices led to the most rewarding destinations. The woman who had once feared eviction from a cottage in Port Royal now stood on the deck of a pirate ship as an integral member of its crew, valued for her skills and loved for who she had become. The transformation was complete, and the future, however uncertain, held promise that the desperate widow could never have imagined.